So, based on Michael's insights, we would like move on to the next speaker. We got a glimpse of how Switzerland is dealing with the topic of regulation. And now we will have the opportunity to get insights about the US approach from Hester Peirce, SEC Commissioner, who will be interviewed by David Waxman. So we will continue now, and I'll hand over the word once again to David and Hester. So sorry also for that, for waiting. The stage is yours, please.
Well, if that technical snafu meant anything, it meant that all of you should apply to register for the conference back in Switzerland in January. It's the most important conference of the year for investors, I'm convinced. And I think you're going to get a lot out of today's virtual session. So yes, as I mentioned earlier, I am honored to be joined today by US SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, who is going to be talking today about the proposal that she's put forth for token safe harbor. We're going to talk about what that means, the progress of that, and a few other matters that are very important when it comes to US regulation focused on digital assets and kind of where things may lead. So Hester, it's great to have you here as well to talk about this critically important topic.
Well, David, thank you, and thanks to Nicolo. It's a delight to be at this conference. I too would prefer to be there in person, but I think sometimes the technical difficulty having to wait is sort of appropriate when you're talking to a regulator, because we regulators make people wait. I do have to start with my standard disclaimer, which is that the views I represent are my own views and not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
That is very important to note. And on that note, let's talk about something that is a burning topic right now in the industry. For years, many companies have tried to put forth proposals for Bitcoin ETFs. So the question is, and especially since just yesterday there was another delay for comment for another proposal, is there a potential future, maybe here in the United States, for a Bitcoin ETF? Is this something that we might see down the road?
Well, so I do think that we'll see a Bitcoin exchange traded product at some point down the road in the United States. Certainly, I've not been shy about saying that it doesn't happen. It hasn't been happening fast enough for me. Yesterday's decision, I should note, was a decision made at the staff level. So the staff can do a number of things on its own without the commission's involvement, and that was one of the things that happened. So people should bear that in mind. I've expressed in the past that I think that the standard that we've applied in looking at Bitcoin exchange traded products is wrong, because it's different than the standard we apply to similar products. We have a new chair at the SEC, Chair Gensler, who I'm still confident will allow us to take a fresh look at this area. But I've also said that I think by waiting as long as we have to approve a Bitcoin exchange traded product, we've made it much more difficult for ourselves. One, the market is much bigger and the interest is much greater. And so it matters a lot more who gets approved first. And two, people have been finding other ways to get access to Bitcoin. And so because of that, I feel like investors have been paying more than they would have otherwise had to pay if there were an approved Bitcoin exchange traded product. Now, one advantage that we now have is that we're seeing other countries moving forward with exchange traded products, not only based on Bitcoin, but based on ETH. And so that experience that those countries have, particularly during times of market volatility in the underlying crypto, I think will be helpful for us as we think about approving one of those in the United States. So long answer to say I'm optimistic that it will happen sometime, but I can't give you a time frame.
Fair enough. So let's move on to talk about token safe harbor. So this is certainly for other tokens, for perhaps new tokens to be introduced. Could you give us a quick summary of it, and then we can go into some of the details about it? Why did you propose token safe harbor in the first place a couple of years ago?
The thinking behind it was there's been a lot of uncertainty around when something is a securities offering. So how do I do a token distribution event without it falling under the securities laws? And certainly from from the perspective of a regulator, what you worry about is when someone buys something, is the person getting the information that she needs to get to make an assessment of what she's buying. And during the 2017 ICO boom, we saw a lot of really unfortunate activity happening. And so concerns about transparency are real. So what I tried to do with the safe harbor is to say, here's a framework within which you can do a token distribution event, provide information to the buyers of those tokens, not be subject to the securities laws for 3 years, with the exception of the anti-fraud laws. If you're out there lying to people, we can go after you. But then after the 3-year period, you should be able to show that your network is decentralized enough, or that your token is functional enough, so that there's not even a question about whether transfers of those tokens should be deemed to be securities offerings, securities transactions. You'd simply move outside of the securities framework at that point.
So your new proposal actually proposes that after about 3 years, they'd have to be some sort of test. It wouldn't necessarily, to use your phrase, a bright line test to describe whether or not it's a security any longer. But if it is a security, they'd have the opportunity perhaps to register as a security. Is that correct?
That is correct. And so, you know, one of the, I put out an initial version, got a lot of great feedback, and then put out a second version a little bit ago, and have been getting some good feedback on that as well. But one of the initial comments I got on the initial version was, we need some more markers around how to figure out if we're decentralized at the end of that 3 years. So we tried to provide some markers for that, although, you know, it's still a matter of great debate even within the industry about what does decentralization mean. And so trying to capture that in a framework is difficult. I still welcome feedback. The framework's up on GitHub, so people should weigh in if they have thoughts on how I can make it better.
Can you imagine a U.S. federal regulator is proposing things on GitHub? I think this is a pretty remarkable thing in and of itself. But you're right. The topic of what actually is decentralized is something that is a burning debate between academics, entrepreneurs in the sector, node operators. I mean, is it the number of nodes, the number of wallets, the distribution, et cetera? It's very, very challenging to do. And every network is different. Proof of work is different than proof of stake, as an example. And there's all sorts of novel methods coming up. So with that in mind, you mentioned that outside counsel would be responsible for essentially delivering some sort of report. And I guess what are attorneys in the space going to need to be armed to be able to do that? Let's say this were to pass or this proposal were to be enacted. How are attorneys supposed to get sufficiently up to speed to be able to advise their clients correctly?
Well, I mean, again, I think we try to provide some things that an outside lawyer and the project could be thinking about, and it, because what those sort of markers are, and they're, the things you mentioned are sort of what we're thinking of, right? Those kinds of things, you can be working toward that and working toward getting as many people involved in the project as possible, getting as many people involved in the network as possible. And so I think you're right that you'd probably want to be talking to your lawyer all the way through to kind of be thinking, what do we need to do to give you lawyer comfort on after the 3-year period, or at the end of the 3-year period, that we're decentralized. And I think there'd be a lot of discussion in the legal community, there already is, around what those markers should be. But as we've seen in this area of the law, it can be quite difficult, and I think there has to be a modicum of good faith on the part of the SEC, to try to help people work through these issues. And so that's something that we would need to continue to work on. I mean, it is certainly the part of the framework, I think, that people are most interested in, trying to tweak and figure out what we need to do there.
So with that in mind, I know that you're here today to talk a little bit about this framework, but you also are seeking comments. What types of comments are you looking for? What type of activity do you want the community to do to perhaps further buttress this proposal?
So, I mean, please give me your comments, be as frank as possible. I've gotten some really good input from people who have taken it quite seriously and have gone in on GitHub and have put great comments in there. So that's one thing that you can do. You can also contact me directly if that's your preference. But I would say that if you think this is something that's important, it's also worth talking to other commissioners at the SEC, because I'm one commissioner of 5. I can't do this on my own, and so if others hear that this is something that would be useful, then I think it's more likely to get through. And certainly the chair, the SEC chair, would need to hear that too. This is an area that's changing so fast, and so there's need for clarity in a lot of different directions. There's need for clarity around custody, as you mentioned, the Bitcoin or Ether-based exchange-traded products. So there are a lot of different things we can be working on. But I think if people feel that a safe harbor type concept is important, then that's something that they need to be raising with the regulators.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about what that means. So if something were not a security, in the United States, it might fall under the purview perhaps of another agency. So have you spoken to other regulators about this, or other agencies or departments? What's the reaction been thus far to your proposal?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked some with folks at the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is responsible for regulating futures products and derivatives products. They have some oversight over spot markets, but it's quite limited. And so that's, if something is not a security, it might well be a commodity. And so that would be one regulator. But I think people are all kind of trying to find their way to what the right regulatory approach is for digital assets. And there's a lot of thinking now going on, not only in regulatory agencies, but also on Capitol Hill, as Congress thinks about whether there needs to be legislation. But people are in the government sector are still really getting their arms around all the activity that's happening. And you've got DeFi going on as well, and that's taking people are still trying to figure out Bitcoin, and then trying to figure out DeFi is a whole other thing. So it's also hard just to compete for attention in this space, because there's a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of conversation about CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. So it's just hard to get people's attention.
Indeed, yes. So last year at CfC, we had a lot of conversation from Christopher Giancarlo, a former CFTC commissioner, who has been really a proponent of the digital dollar, which I think is pretty outstanding. But it would be a huge sea change for the United States. Before we get into talking about DeFi regulation, which is absolutely something that we should cover, it's a hot topic as well. You're right. Janet Yellen has previously expressed concerns that the current regulatory framework is just not up to snuff for regulating digital assets. You mentioned there that there are a number of different agencies that are currently potentially responsible for digital assets. So what does the conversation look like in DC? How does coordination occur when it's so many different agencies that might be responsible? You've got the OCC, Treasury, Fed, all the different regulators. How does it work?
Well, certainly on a question about something like, is this a security or not, that really does primarily fall within our bailiwick. And so that's something that we can really do a lot of work on just on our own. That said, there's a lot of informal communication. As I said, I talk to regulators at the CFTC, and our agency talks a lot to the banking regulators. There are a number of working group type things that bring together financial regulators, where they talk about a number of issues, and certainly crypto is one of them. And then, of course, there are international groups as well that bring together regulators to talk about these things. So I think, given the size of crypto, actually a fair amount of time is spent at the cross-regulatory level talking about these things. That said, with a new administration having come in not so long ago, they're working on lots of different issues, and so crypto is one of them, but it's certainly not the only one.
And I think that's an important reminder for those of us in the crypto space that this is not the only topic in the world. Sometimes we should zoom out a little bit. So, token safe harbor, one of the reasons why I think the media has been so happy about this is because it might give the U.S. a fighting chance to compete on the global stage when there is a lot of innovation happening in the digital asset space elsewhere. So do you think this might help position us favorably? Could we see job growth in the US with a proposal like this one?
I do. I mean, I've heard from a lot of people who say they just avoid the U.S. because the regulatory structure is not favorable. It's not even favorable in the sense of being easy to deal with. It's just not even knowing what the regulatory structure is. So I think providing any kind of clarity would help. And the question around whether something needs to be treated as a securities transaction is a big one, not only for projects that are trying to launch their networks, but also for trading platforms, because if you're trading something that's a security, then you have to register with us as an exchange or as a sort of an exchange light. And so these questions really do matter. And I think we do want to have, there are a lot of really, really interesting people working in this area, and we do want to have that work happen here in the United States. Of course, this is something, the technology allows for international collaboration in a way that really few technologies before it have. And so that's something that we also want to encourage, but we certainly want US citizens to be able to be part of that innovation.
So before this panel, or for this fireside chat, we've heard from the Swiss. And so I've got to ask, to what extent are you and the SEC listening and watching how other countries are dealing with the digital asset space? Are there lessons to be learned here?
There's certainly lessons to be learned, and I think other jurisdictions have taken a more proactive approach, whether it's just at the legislative level, building a framework that really recognizes some of the unique aspects of digital assets, or whether it's by providing regulatory clarity or providing sandbox options so that you can actually work with a regulator as you're trying to put something out there. So we have a lot to learn, I think, from our international counterparts. As I mentioned, there are a lot of conversations at the international level about digital assets. I do worry sometimes that regulators who have a negative view of crypto may feed off one another at the international level. So I hope we can learn the positive lessons from our regulatory colleagues abroad, but not take back any of that negative perception of crypto.
Later this morning, I'm going to be speaking with the CEOs of a Swiss bank focused on the crypto space and essentially the Swiss stock exchange's digital asset sector. In the US, we have not seen tremendous liquidity currently on some of the security tokens exchanges, or you call them exchange lights, the ATSs. Do you think that we're falling behind here in the US? If so, why?
Well, I think we're going to see a transformation of the securities industry with digital assets, with blockchain technology. I don't know how long that will take, and I don't know exactly what form that transformation will take, but there are people in the United States that are working quite hard on trying to figure out how to integrate blockchain into some of the traditional aspects of the securities markets. But again, because we have a pretty intricate and difficult regulatory framework, it can take a long time to work through things. I mean, we're all witnessing that with the Bitcoin exchange traded product, but there are a lot of other areas where people are trying to do things and they have to get regulatory approval to do it. And that can just take, it's a long iterative approach or process where you're going back and forth with not only the SEC, but also the self-regulatory organization, FINRA, which regulates broker-dealers and therefore regulates these exchange light platforms, these ATSs. And that can just be a very long process.
And it's unfortunate a lot of people here. Oh, I guess there's only a few minutes left. So switching topics a little bit, let's talk about DeFi. Just one real question on DeFi.
Please,
so
please.
This is out of almost nowhere an enormous industry. A couple of years ago, it was a theory for why Ethereum might have additional value, right, post the ICO boom, as you mentioned. And today you have billions of dollars of value locked up into DeFi smart contracts and extraordinary innovations like automated market makers. How do you personally view the DeFi space? Do you think that do you have either a warning or a lesson to teach to DeFi entrepreneurs and investors?
Well, I mean, I have a warning in the sense that you always need to think about how things interact with the law, including the securities law. But, you know, I also think that we have something to learn from DeFi. It's an attempt to try to make the financial system more resilient, more open to more people, and less reliant on central intermediaries. And I think those are generally positive things. Now, you know, there's a lot of money now involved in this space, as you mentioned. And so what that means is that people need to be very careful. They need to be careful in thinking about how they're interacting with DeFi, make sure that it really is DeFi. Sometimes something looks decentralized on the surface, but may not be decentralized. So, you know, approach it with great care, of course, as I always say, when you engage in anything where you're putting your money on the line.
Thank you. So, Nicolo.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and especially Hester also, again, once for that really interesting discussion. So I would like to ask you one question that we got from a participant here. I mean, I tried to put it in context, right? So we talked about a lot of challenges that exist in the US. So the question is, following the discussions over the last year, someone could ask him or herself that the US had not a real interest to support the digital asset industry and rather make it difficult for companies to be successful. Do you share that view, or why do most of the regulators see more threats than chances?
Well, I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. I think there are some regulators and others in government who would just like the space to go away. But I think there are others who are really quite interested in seeing what positive can be done in this space and how regulators can work to emphasize that positive aspect. You know, I think with any mature regulatory structure, doing new things takes a long time. That's been one of my persistent criticisms of my own agency, whether it's with respect to crypto or anything else. I think we just need to be more open to innovation. And that's one reason there's been a lot of concentration in the financial industry, because it can be really hard to break in as a new competitor. But that's one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about digital assets, about the crypto industry, because I think they are forcing us to sort of rethink how we've approached innovation, and also they're, you know, building sort of a parallel system and saying, okay, well, we're gonna set up a system that's more open and more competitive, and is really designed to serve more people, and so I think it's a good thing for the regulatory structure and for I think the society in general to try to shake up the competitive landscape a bit.
Thank you for that. So the last question, and it's a really short one. What's next? So what are the next steps we can expect, or what is happening next now with your 2.0 proposal? So what can we expect next?
Well, again, I think it'll depend on whether I can get the safe harbor on the chairman's agenda. I would urge people just to, you know, pay attention to what Chair Gensler is saying. He's come out pretty early in his tenure calling for regulation of the spot markets in crypto. And so I would say just, you know, keep your eye on other things that he's saying. I think that'll be telling about the direction in which we go.
Okay. Good. Then thank you both for this discussion and the exchange. And with the discussion of Michael months before, it's important to see and to understand how different countries are approaching this topic and what measures are taken. So I'm sure that there will be a lot of movement in 2021, and especially in this area. So we will continue to be curious about what is happening next. And as I already mentioned in the last virtual day, I'm looking forward to hopefully welcoming Hester in St. Moritz in person in January 2022. I'll try it. So
Sounds
as Michael, Hester and David will now join the networking room to continue the discussion and answer questions from your side. So thank you very much once again, David and Hester, for being with us.
Thanks, Nicolo.